Okay, so let's start to talk a little bit about neuroanatomy. Maybe I'll talk mainly about three things. One is the lobes of the brain, two is the sulci of the brain, and three is the main, let's call it some of the main parts of the brain, the main nuclei, if you want, and the main parts of the brain. So let's start with the most exterior part of the brain, the lobes of the brain. There are four lobes if you include the insula also as a lobe, so we have five, but the main ones are four lobes: the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes if you include the insula, so it's the fifth. So let's say some words about each one of them. The frontal lobe is important for our personality and for motor function, as the precentral gyrus is in the frontal lobe. The parietal lobe, which includes the postcentral gyrus, is important for sensation, proprioception, and things like this. The temporal lobe is important for some emotions. The amygdala is there for our memories, because the hippocampus is there, for hearing, as the primary auditory cortex is there, for the meaning of what we say, as the Wernicke area is there, and those are the main things I wanted to say. And the occipital lobe, which is important for vision, one of the visual cortex is there. By the way, if I talked about the Wernicke area, I should have mentioned the Broca area, which is in the frontal lobe. It's important for articulation, for the motor part of the speech, of the language. So it's in the frontal lobe, in the inferior part, usually in the left side. So those are the lobes of the brain. If you include the insula, if you take the parietal part and move it a little bit upward, and the temporal part and move it a little bit downward, you will see that you have something that look like cortex, or what it's a cortex, and it's inside. You take the parietal and the temporal and separate them, so you can see the insula looking at you right inside. Okay, so this is the insula. About its function, I don't want to say a thing because it's not totally clear. So those are the lobes of the brain. Now let's continue. Let's move to the sulci of the brain. I will talk about the main sulci only. So in the frontal lobe, we have the superior frontal sulcus. It's quite anterior. It's quite superior because it's superior frontal sulcus. And inferiorly to this, as the name suggests, there is the inferior frontal sulcus. Now, there are two more parts in the area of the inferior part of the anterior lobe, of the frontal lobe. We have the anterior ramus and the ascending ramus. I won't talk about them too much. Remember that we have the precentral gyrus in the frontal lobe. Therefore, I will have the precentral sulcus in the frontal lobe. Then you will have the central sulcus, which divides the frontal and parietal lobes. So the central sulcus is quite important. Think of it that the precentral gyrus, which is very important, it's important for the motor of your body, and the postcentral gyrus, which is important for sensation, are divided by the central sulcus and are, I don't know, you can see them or you can identify them by identifying the central sulcus. So the central sulcus is very important. So we have the precentral sulcus, the central sulcus, and the postcentral sulcus. Okay, it's quite with the gyruses. So we have the central sulcus, which divides the frontal and parietal lobes. We have the precentral gyrus in front of it, anteriorly to it. You have the precentral sulcus. Posterior to the central sulcus, you have the postcentral gyrus, which is important for sensation, as we said. And posteriorly to the postcentral gyrus, you have the postcentral sulcus, which is quite logical. You also have in the area of the parietal lobe the marginal sulcus, which you can say a little bit laterally or medially to the postcentral sulcus. Another sulcus that you can find in the parietal lobe is the interparietal sulcus, which is quite perpendicular to the postcentral sulcus. It's posteriorly to it, and you have the postcentral sulcus and you have the interparietal sulcus. And now if you move more posteriorly, you will find between the parietal and occipital lobes the parieto-occipital sulcus, which is quite logical. Again, dividing the parietal and occipital lobes. Now, between the parietal and temporal lobes, you will find the Sylvian fissure, also known as the lateral sulcus. Now, in the temporal lobe, you will find two more sulci. You have the Sylvian fissure in the superior part, and you have two more sulci, the superior sulcus and the inferior sulcus of the temporal lobe. So that they are called accordingly the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. Now, between the temporal and occipital lobe, you can find a notch between them, which is called, in the inferior part between the temporal and occipital lobes, you will find this notch, which is called preoccipital notch. Preoccipital notch. Before the occipital lobe, you will find it. Now, in the lateral part of the occipital lobe, you will find the lateral occipital sulcus. And those are the sulci that I want to talk about. Let's try to put it straight. So we'll go from the front to the posterior part, and maybe from the midline to the lateral, if you can say so. Mainly from front to the posterior part. So frontal lobe, you have the superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus, precentral sulcus, and laterally anterior ramus and ascending ramus. Superior frontal sulcus, inferior frontal sulcus, precentral sulcus, anterior ramus, the ascending ramus, and ascending ramus. Now, dividing the frontal and the parietal, you have the central sulcus. Posterior to it, you have the postcentral sulcus, because you have the postcentral gyrus in the parietal lobe. You also have the marginal sulcus and the interparietal sulcus, which is perpendicular to the postcentral sulcus. Now, if you divide the parietal and the occipital lobe, you will have the parieto-occipital sulcus. In the occipital lobe, you will mainly have the lateral occipital sulcus, and between the occipital and the temporal lobe, you will have the preoccipital notch, which divide them. In the temporal lobe, you will have the Sylvian fissure, also known as the lateral sulcus. And if you call it, it divides the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe. So let's call it part of the temporal lobe. And in the temporal lobe, you will have two main sulci, which are called the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. So we worked and talked about the main sulci of the brain. Let's continue. This part will be maybe mainly about the main parts of the brain. Okay, so let's talk about it. So if we start from, let's start from above, like we are looking it from above. So we are starting with frontal and parietal lobe. Those are the first lobe that we will see in the brain. Then we will go down and down and down until you will see a gyrus that is going something like this, which is called the cingulate gyrus. Above the corpus callosum, you will see the cingulate gyrus. Then if you will continue, you will be able to see the basal ganglia. Then in the basal ganglia, you will see the ventricles of the brain, the lateral horns, the lateral ventricles with anterior horns, posterior horns, third ventricle in the middle. And what you will see around those ventricles of the brain are the basal ganglia. And if you think about the basal ganglia, you need to think mainly about the caudate nucleus. You need to think about the putamen and the globus pallidus. Now, the caudate and the putamen is sometimes called the striatum. Now, the caudate is maybe I need to say a structure that goes quite anteriorly in the basal ganglia, but goes also posteriorly. It does something like this. So you can see the head of the caudate, and here in the posterior part, very close to the posterior horns of the lateral ventricles, you will see a very tiny part of the basal ganglia of the caudate nucleus, and in the anterior part you will see a much more massive part of the caudate nucleus in the same axial plane. Now, posteriorly to the caudate nucleus, you will see, if this is the caudate, you will see here more laterally the putamen, and more internally the globus pallidus, which is divided to globus pallidus externus and globus pallidus internus. Now, sometimes the putamen and the globus pallidus are called together, and they look together as lens shaped. So they are also called lentiform nucleus because they are lens shaped, lentiform nucleus. Now, if we are going more inside, close to the posterior horn of the lateral ventricles, you will find the thalamus, which is a very important motor area which connects, the tracts and the cortex and everything. It's a very important transition area, the thalamus. So, caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, and here the thalamus. Anterior, posterior. Now, all this complex, caudate, putamen, globus pallidus, and thalamus, if you are going a little bit more laterally in the brain, you will find maybe the insula. Remember, the insula, if you take the parietal lobe and take it upward, and the temporal lobe and take it downward, you will see some cortex, some gyruses looking at you. This is the insula. And now, when we are looking inside the brain in axial plane, you will see the caudate, the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the thalamus. And here, more laterally, you will see the insula. Now, if we continue and going downward, we will get to the part of the, let's call it the midbrain, the pons, the medulla eventually. So, Again, I'm not going to talk about maybe even not most part of the most important parts of the brain, because hypothalamus, which is, if you think about the third ventricle, anterior and inferiorly to it, you will have the hypothalamus, which connects to the pituitary gland. And in the brainstem, you will find the midbrain, inferiorly to it, the pons, and then inferiorly to it, the medulla oblongata. More posteriorly, after the tentorium, after the occipital lobe, you will have the tentorium, and then you will have the cerebellum, which is important for coordination, for example. In the cerebellum, you have two lobes, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. Now, we also have the limbic system with all the structures in them. In this system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the fornix, and the mammillary bodies are very important for this area. The area of the amygdala is quite like in the temporal lobe, and then the hippocampus part of it in the this part is in the temporal lobe, fornix going to the mammillary bodies. Those may be the gross big parts of the brain. I didn't talk about red nucleus or cerebellar peduncles or the sinuses or the falx cerebri or the corpus callosum or many other things. But I wanted to give a gross idea of the main areas of the brain, the lobes, especially the sulcus, especially, and the very big areas of the brain. Thank you very much, and that's it. You can see in Radiopedia, I'm quite sure that there is very good explanation of all those areas. The main thing that I talked about is there. You can see the Radiopedia neuroanatomy page or article if you want for those areas that I just talked about. Thank you very much. If there are any mistakes or correction, please tell me, and that's it.